All right, so I'm kind of just recording this with no script, with only very bare bones notes. I'm just going to try to get across all the information I feel is necessary to get across. So, for background, for my entire life I had aphantasia, which is a very minor condition that doesn't really affect much. Basically, I wasn't very good at imagining images. My image recognition was fine. I wasn't dyslexic, I'm still not. Um, I could recognize people's faces fine and tell who I was looking at. I could remember things fine. It's just that I could not picture images, which, among other things, I'm pretty sure contributed to me having a very, very poor understanding of, a very poor ability to mentally map the place I live. I couldn't really tell where streets were or where they led. I was very bad at that kind of thing. And imagining a figure in my head, like any sort of diagram or like physical object that I might be trying to imagine, like sitting on a table, that was pretty much out of the question. The best I could ever get out of my imagined vision was it was like what you see when it's the middle of the night, all of the lights are out, and your eyes have adjusted to the darkness, but not completely. It was very tenuous, very bad. It was very bad, basically. So that was true up until 18 days ago. Whereas now I can imagine things in color. How exactly that happened, I'm not entirely sure on the mechanics of. It was mostly due to intentional processes. It was not entirely unexpected. However, the amount to which it's changed is rather surprising. As for what my mental imagery looks like now, if I'm concentrating, it's kind of like looking at a full color screen, but with really bad glare. Like, the sun is out, it's shining directly on the screen. You're really not getting that good an image, but you can still see. You can still see what's on the screen. You can see. You're not blind. You're not blind to what you're looking at. So that's basically the change that's happened here. And I'm going to explain, or attempt to explain, how exactly that change occurred and all of the steps that went in between where I started and where I am now. So I'm probably going to be rather long-winded here because some of it is background knowledge, some of it is very kind of fundamental, theoretical, and abstract, but not in a I've become a master of my field way, more in a I'm still a fool, but I can teach you how to become a slightly wiser fool. That's where I believe I am right now. So, this is also going to involve me kind of just using a lot of jargon, most of which is half invented. So just be prepared for that. I'm going to do my best to explain all of the concepts, because if I'm not being clear, then I feel like there's really no point in relaying any of this information in the first place. So the most basic concept that I think is important to go over here is what I call the mindscape. Now, that's basically just a frilly formalization of some of the most basic stuff imaginable. When you're imagining an image, or you're picturing what would happen this, what would happen that, or you're remembering something, or you're imagining a scene from a movie, or you're making something up, you'd say that all of that stuff is happening in your head. All of the scenery is being put together in your mind. So we're going to say that in your mind is a defined place, just for the sake of separating that from attempting to imagine real sensations. So we're just going to call that the mindscape. It's really nothing it's kind of just a term that I want to have so that I can have a slightly separate word to use for this narrow use of a concept. So it's relevant because a lot of the exercises that got me to where I am have to do with specifically in the mindscape rather than with your physical body, which the term I will use for that is vessel. You're going to have to separate your vessel from the virtual self that exists in the mindscape, which for ease of terminology, I'll also give a name. I'll call that the homunculus. Part of the reason I chose the word homunculus is just because I think it's a funny word. Um, so basically, the first thing that you're going to want to try to do, the first most fundamental step, is try to get good at visualizing. But if you're like me and you're starting from a point of having aphantasia, that's kind of categorically a problem. I'd say more broadly, what you're going to want to try to do is virtualizing, which is just a coinage that extends the term visualizing to include any sense. So, touch, movement, sound, etc. If you can imagine pretty much anything in any sense, that's what you're going to want to use. You can use multiple at the same time, you can pick a favorite, whatever works best for you. However, I found it to be most effective when I imagined that I was moving around the space. Like I would imagine that I'm when I initially started doing this, I was much more actively in dance classes and doing a dance program, so that's usually what I would imagine. I would imagine I'm in the studio, the room with Marley and the mirrors on the walls and stuff like that, and I'm just moving around, shimmying, doing whatever. One of the important things about this is it's important to focus specifically on the sensations of this and not to have any sort of goal in mind. Like, even if I was reciting a dance that I had been rehearsing, I generally didn't try to keep it completely coherent and, time flowing linearly and make sure that it felt real. That's not entirely a fruitful exercise. Maybe if you're getting really good at this, you might want to do that just as an exercise for its own sake. However, I've never, due to my inexperience, I can't personally confirm nor deny whether that has any eventual practical applications. So what I'm going to say is if your goal is to stand in the kitchen and make yourself a ham sandwich, don't be overly story driven in your attempt to do that. Like if you drop the knife on the floor, make another knife because this is literally all in your mind. You make the rules. So it is not at all important to have a consistent and sensible story flow. And of course, if you're not very good at the imagery side of things, try to focus more on not seeing where things are, but more just having an idea of what the space is like. Because you can very much do that even if you have no visual sense. You can have a sense of the space, especially if the space that you're working in is made up and can freely warp to your liking. So that's the first thing, basically virtualizing and getting used to the sensations of moving around and associating yourself with the homunculus. And a really important thing, a reason that I specifically made this much effort to differentiate the imagined self from the physical one, the homunculus and the vessel, is because a pitfall that I fell into many times when I was early in my practice of this stuff, was I would try to imagine a sensation and I would get overly invested in imagining it as applying to my vessel. Like, if I was imagining that, I don't know, I'm touching my leg, then I would imagine that my homunculus is moving around, I'm using my arm to touch my leg, but I would get overly focused instead of imagining that that sensation is happening to the leg of my homunculus. I would start trying to make it feel like it was happening on my vessel. I hope what I'm saying now is making sense. It's just that you're going to want to imagine these sensations as distinctly not physical, happening inside the mindscape and not in meat space. I don't know how common that word is, who cares? Anyways, it's reasonable to say, even though this is probably going to be somewhat obvious, that this is not easy when you're first starting out. It's hard to concentrate in enough of a way that you can sort of get immersed. I've recently been trying to kind of teach some of my friends how to do this, and one of them described it in a way that was very accurate to the way I remembered how it felt when I was starting out. You get these brief sparks of time when you're very invested, when you're actually when you feel like you're really getting into it. Most of the time it's very dull, it's difficult to imagine. It's difficult to imagine in any sort of detail. but occasionally you'll get that moment where you feel like immersed. So, moving on from this, I'd like to talk about something that kind of follows from that that's a little bit more abstract. I call it sense calibration. Um, basically, the easiest way to give context to this is to explain how I thought of the idea. It's kind of a basic idea, but basically, I was sitting where I'm sitting right now on this couch, and I was thinking about another place in this house. And I was thinking, what if instead of doing that, I imagined what I'm seeing right now? Like, I tried to imagine the room that I am in right now, and I tried to make my imagination match my actual like sensory experience as quickly as not quickly, as closely as possible. So I call that calibration and not just synchronization because theoretically there could be other sorts of synchronization. One person that I was talking to in a group chat that I'm in said that they're currently trying to basically. I'm going to give a very short explanation of what it actually is, but basically the effort that they are undertaking is to reprogram in a sort of way the sensations that they take in from the outside so that certain things when perceived appear different. So that would sort of be um, sensory overriding or something like that, reprogramming, something of that nature. um, Whereas what I'm trying to do is calibration. Basically, it's where you try your best to imagine exactly what you are perceiving. And I feel like potentially, if we're to treat the like sensory intake from like that's coming into the sensory organs of your vessel and the imagined reality inside the mindscape, we're going to say that like perhaps you would be getting whatever part of your neurology is in charge of correlating those things more familiar with how it correlates. Like, I didn't initially do this with visual signals because even at the time that I came up with this, at which point my aphantasia had lightened slightly, I could see now. I still wasn't very good at it. Initially, what I tried was with moving my body. I would move around my vessel and my homunculus in the same ways as best I could. So I would move around my arm and I would try to exactly, or as exactly as possible, recreate all of those motions with my homunculus. It's a little bit hard. You're going to have to take it slow, and you're going to want to try not to do too much at once. Walking, you'll realize how complicated of an action walking is when, one, you have to teach a child how to do it, or two, you have to try to imitate it one to one with your vessel and your homunculus, because so much of it is just built up automatically because you've been doing it your whole life that you don't really think about the entire process unless you're trying to really dissect it as this kind of exercise would require. So what I was initially doing is if I was walking very slowly, like almost one muscle at a time, like a bad quap player. And I would occasionally also move other limbs. I would try to imitate the movement of my head around the space. And at one point, I tried speaking, and I tried to synchronize the speech coming out of my vessel with the speech that I was producing with the corresponding parts of my body of my homunculus. That also is extremely complicated because phonation is a very multifaceted, complicated process. I mean, that's why phonemes have to be described with words like alveolar approximant instead of just R. It's incredibly complicated and intensely physical. If you're doing it more muscle by muscle, it'll be easier to wrap your head around. So you might be noticing kind of a flaw in my like storytelling in this video, which is that I kind of jumped from still completely aphantasiac to can see a little, which did not happen like on its own. That's because in addition to doing the calibration stuff, I was also doing basically a chakra focusing exercise. Now, I'm not going to like accuse the people in my audience of being hardcore skeptics or being unwilling to listen to what I have to say just because I used the word chakra. It's just that I feel it's important to note, even for people who are relatively receptive to that idea or who have like done meditative exercises involving the chakra system before, I didn't pull this out of thin air, and I didn't let anyone else pull it out of thin air and give it to me. I'm only continuing to use this terminology because, in my experience, I tried an exercise that explicitly uses it, and then I got almost immediate results. Of course, this wasn't the first time I'd experimented with the system, but it was the first time in a very long time, and it was the first time I had done the specific exercise I was trying to do. And the fact that it caused such an instant change means I feel like, in order to be responsible with the way I teach other people about what happened, I feel like I have to bring this up. So I hope that preamble wasn't excessive. Um, Now that we've got that context out of the way, I'm just going to actually get into it. So the chakra system, as it's usually presented in like any article you would read or any book, that's pretty much what I was using, and it pretty much was what worked. So crown, third eye, throat, heart, solar plexus, sacrum, and base. Now, I should say those locations don't actually correspond to the organs they are named after. Obviously, the third eye is not even really named after an organ that you possess in your vessel. Um, those just happen to be good labels for where they are roughly. So, the top of the head, the middle of the frontal bone, right here, where you would usually see a third eye drawn in an illustration, uh, somewhere around the larynx, somewhere around the heart, or perhaps a little bit lower than that, maybe around the diaphragm. The solar plexus, nerve ganglia, that's pretty accurate. Somewhere around the lumbar vertebrae or the sacrum of the pelvic girdle, and somewhere around the pubic symphysis. So that's where the locations approximately are. Like with any physical organ of the vessel, there's going to be individual variation. So basically, you just have to figure out, you just have to feel it out, basically, is the initial thing. It's kind of like figuring out where all of your ribs are. You can do that if you, like, palpate enough on your own skin. So you're going to want to figure out, okay, so I know that there's these 7 points. Where does it feel like they're located on my body? And can I tell them apart? Now, this is part of the reason why I went into so much detail about the homunculus versus vessel distinction. It's because the chakras are a distinctly non-physical thing, or to whatever extent that they are a physical thing that can be said to be related to the vessel, they're not physically distinguished enough and perceptible enough that you should really try to imagine it as a sensation on the vessel. You should imagine it as a thing that is being experienced by the homunculus. Though usually when I do this sort of exercise, I'm doing a kind of synchronized or calibrated movement. I'm not generally moving my vessel around much, nor my homunculus, so you kind of assume that they're both in the same position, that they're both, if you want to use such language, superimposed on top of each other in such a way that you could kind of imagine they're both doing the same stuff. So you can imagine them in the places they would be on your vessel, but I guess it's kind of fruitful to remember that they're not here. They're not here. They're wherever that is on your homunculus. But like I said before, I can give a pretty good description of how the experience of this feels and how it should be self-guided. However, I don't know much at all about the fine mechanics of it. I don't really have a good theory behind exactly how any of it works. I don't really think that's important right now. If there is going to be any sort of theory, and I mean, I certainly hope so, this isn't, I feel like there is a lot of useful study that could come out of this, but if there's going to be a theory, it's going to have to be established slowly, carefully, granularly, etc. That's a bit of a tangent, though. I was going to say, I'm not entirely sure how this works, just it's important to have that distinction in mind, or more so, to have already been using it in practice so that you don't have to be actively thinking about it in order for it to be there and work in your favor. So, basically what I tried to do was focus on all of the chakras at the same time. I started from the crown, I moved in a caudal direction, I moved downward. why am I using fancy anatomical terminology? I moved downward from the top of the head. Then I also tried doing the same thing from the base and upward. I found a very strange effect to happen, at least after I had done a little bit of this, which is that I didn't really have to put much effort into consciously feeling all of them. Once I had grounded my focus enough on whichever one I chose to be first, which I usually did it from the top down, so I'm going to use the crown as the for the purpose of this explanation, the first one. Once I had focused my attention enough on the one I was using as the first, I would move on to the second, and the first would still kind of persist in that imagined sensation. Like it would still feel like I was concentrating on it. It would feel like there was some connection between the two of them. I would also persistently feel that there was a connection between whichever one I was currently concentrating on and the base. I find that there's a little bit of a weird difference in these two methods. Like if you're moving from the top down, then the actively feeling ones and the like range where there's that kind of electric feeling between the focused one and the base, they don't overlap. Whereas if you're moving from the bottom up, they completely overlap. That is somewhat non-pertinent and theoretical. However, I think that was kind of important to note that I did do it in both directions, and I think the fact that I had done it in both directions with enough focus was what caused the change. Because I was thinking about this, I was focusing my attention on those places on my body. I was, in fact, sitting on this couch. I spent a lot of my time sitting on this particular couch. And suddenly I realized that, my homunculus, I was imagining that I was looking down at my body, and I realized that I could see it in much more detail than ever before. I wasn't intentionally giving much visual definition, but whenever I attempted to imagine myself moving, I could. And that was what was very strange, because I had never experienced that before. I had never experienced the ability to imagine such things, except when I was literally falling asleep, which I'm not entirely sure what is implied by the fact that when you dream, you can see, because that's always been my experience. I have perfect vision in dreams, but not when I'm imagining something while fully awake until now. I'm not really sure of the mechanics of that either, but it's certainly a phenomenon that I observed. But all of this long-windedness to say is that those exercises going down and up and down is eventually what led to a little crack in the barrier between me and being able to visually imagine a sensation. So those focusing exercises combined with the calibration exercises, which I still do both of those, since this is a very recent development and it's not like I'm going to suddenly stop. I've got to investigate more, I've got to explore more. It was the combination of those two that led to progress. I'd like to kind of end off the video with a little bit of theory, a little bit of my speculation on how some of this works based on things that I've personally observed. So, I was reading this book where there's a scene where someone is taking a picture of a shoreline. There are a few characters standing there. One of them is in the background standing on some rocks. I'm not going to give a full context because it's not important. What's mainly important is the experience that led to this observation. When I initially read that part of the book, I had a sort of scene in my mind. Now, of course, this was less in the sense of being able to actually see any of it, and more in the sense of having a sort of wireframe theoretical awareness of where things in the scene were. Like a person who is actually blind being able to remember the layout of their own house because they've been through it so many times they know exactly where everything is. And I realize now that I think back on that with the ability to actually imagine visual sensations, is that I don't think the scene has been newly constructed. It feels as if it was already there, and I'm only just now able to perceive the visual components of it. Because if I'm able to, let's think about this from a purely neurological perspective, thinking of all phenomena as originating inside the brain. even if the phenomenon of consciousness doesn't happen inside the brain, which is something I'm not entirely clear on, it's still pretty clear that a lot of the processes behind what goes into forming a thought and what goes into creating perceptions from just the nerve signals that are created by the eyes and the uh, cochlear nerves and such things, they happen in the neurons. A lot of it is very poorly understood, but it goes on in there, or at least that's the perspective I'm going to take when I'm thinking about this. Since I'm able to see when I dream, there must be something going on in there that is able to simulate images, and there was already something like that back when I was fully aphantasiac, or at least to whatever extent I was. I could occasionally get the vaguest of sensations. It just wasn't really good enough to count for anything. And of course, I've always been able to see. My vision is perfect. I'm not colorblind. I don't have any sort of concrete visual impairment. I can see what's in front of me. I'm, I lack any disability in the with vessel angle of literally seeing what is around me and what is in front of me. So it feels like, despite the fact that I wasn't able to experience something that I was imagining, it feels like a logical conclusion to draw that there was already some sort of part of my brain that was processing those visual signals, even if it wasn't able to sort of break through to the part of me that I consider myself, that experiences them. This kind of ties into an earlier concept that I had discussed with myself, for which I also used the term homunculus. These aren't really the sensory homunculus and the imaginary homunculus are like distinctly different concepts. I don't really think they apply to each other, but basically, I formulated this concept of there's this you that you feel like is inside your head. That's not actually how perception works, but it feels like it is. It feels like you're a tiny virtual person watching your own perceptions on a screen. That kind of explanation actually has a name. It's called the homunculus fallacy, which is where I originally took the name from, because that doesn't actually explain how that small person would perceive what they're looking at. But aside from that, as a model of like how it feels to perceive, I think it's valuable. So I observed one day when I was on a long car ride, that it had been raining for hours and hours, and I had just been looking out the windows. I had a book, but I wasn't reading from it. I was just kind of looking out the windows, bored. And eventually, when we reached our destination, it had stopped raining, or actually, I think it was still raining, but we went inside. We went inside it was a hotel room, and I noticed that in my vision, there was static. Now, visual static is kind of just a constant presence for some people, and I think it's kind of there for everyone because even though you have good fidelity vision, you are ultimately just a very complex neural network processing visual noise that gets processing signals that are incomprehensible to anything except your brain. So like, but this was different. It was very noticeable. It looked like there was TV static rain falling constantly. And I pretty quickly put together that I, of course, don't have any experimental or even theoretical confirmation of this, but I'm very certain that it's what was happening. I had spent so long looking out the rainy window that my brain had started trying to correct for the noise that was created by the rain. Kind of like how you can always see your nose. Your eyes are always picking up the light that is reflected by your nose. You're always able to look at it if you are thinking about it, but it usually doesn't come up. You're usually ignoring it implicitly, and that's not a conscious act of ignoring. That is a subconscious, or I guess pre-conscious. Neither of those terms have very strict meanings. It's a pre-conscious phenomenon that the nose disappears from your vision. And I would say that in the same way, some part of my brain that does the visual processing was trying to remove the visual noise. It was trying to offset the signal created by the rain. So it created its own static that was supposed to be opposing the rain. It didn't, of course, work because it's not a perfectly engineered machine. It can't predict exactly what's going to come into its eyes, and yada yada, but still it was an interesting thing to see. Fast forward to something else. One of my friends recommended that I watch, I can't actually remember what anime it was, but they recommended that I watch an anime, and like a fool, like a foolhardy person, which is often what I am, I watched 15 hours with almost no breaks. And I was watching it with subtitles. I was watching the original audio in Japanese. And then I finished off a few more episodes once I woke up the next morning, and I found that whenever I was listening to someone talk and I couldn't discern what they were saying, it sounded like Japanese. Like, I should probably be more clear about what that actually means. First of all, probably part of the reason I was able to experience this phenomenon in the first place is because I'm like an amateur linguist. I'm familiar with the phonotactics and phonology of certain languages, and Japanese is such a culturally ubiquitous language online that I'm kind of familiar with it, whether I want to be or not. And I mean, it's an interesting language. It's not like I try to avoid it, but still, I know how it sounds. I know how its sounds work. Um, so of course, everyone experiences those moments where you're hearing someone speak and you can tell that it is speech. And you can tell that it is in the language you recognize. That's probably mostly going to be qualifiable for monolingual people like myself. I only speak English. But presumably, multilingual people could also do a similar thing. You could recognize which one of your known languages something you're hearing is in. And if you have a good enough understanding, if you have a good enough recognition of languages you don't speak based on how they sound, like if you don't speak French but you can still tell that something is French by hearing it because it sounds like French, difficult to describe again, but people who know what I mean know what I mean. You can tell that it is what it is, but you can't discern the words. So I might one day walk up to like I might walk by the bedroom door, the door to my brother's bedroom, and hear him talking with someone on the phone, and I'll generally be able to tell, oh, he's talking with someone on the phone, and furthermore, I'll be able to tell, oh, he's talking in English. Now, I generally don't actually have to ask that question because my brother is also monolingual, he only speaks English, but after that binge session, followed by a few more episodes of basically torturing the recognition parts of my brain into I'm not entirely sure how it worked. Like with a lot of things I've discussed here, I'm not entirely sure how the precise process went. But I walked by the door. I couldn't discern what he and the person he was on the phone with were saying. And I knew that neither of them spoke Japanese. Certainly not with enough confidence either to have a conversation in it that appeared to be going rather fast paced. I opened the door, and it was in English, because obviously it was in English. And I said to him, were you just speaking Japanese? And he said no. Because, of course, he hadn't just been speaking a language that he doesn't know how to speak. But that's what it had sounded like. I wasn't able to point out Japanese words, which, like, I only know a few basic nouns, grammatical particles, and pronouns, but still, I hadn't been able to pick out anything. But I also hadn't been able to pick out any English words either. I noticed the same effect just a few minutes later when I came back to my computer and continued watching whatever YouTube video I was watching. It was not recorded with a professional microphone, and it was of people having a conversation. So there were a few seconds when I started it where I had to kind of get back into the flow of what they were saying. And after a few seconds, it registered as English spoken with a Northern City's vowel shift regional accent, like basically the same way I talk. But for the first few seconds, when I hadn't been able to instantly put together the things that they were saying, the words, it had sounded like Japanese. Like, it's kind of hard to describe even in like linguistic jargon what exactly the difference felt like. But if I heard, like, for example, English has lots of consonant clusters, lots of consonants that come one after the other without a vowel in between. When I would hear one of those, I wouldn't process it as an English language consonant cluster. I would process it, it would come to my self, my homunculus, my consciousness, as already having been packaged as syllables that are being reduced in the way that they would be when spoken by a Japanese speaker. Like I said, even the linguistic jargon that I'm using kind of unclear. And this part of the video is just an appendix anyway. This is kind of past the point of the actual stuff that I was trying to make this video for in the first place, but I still find it to be interesting and relevant. So I feel like basically the barrier that exists between the sensory homunculus and the rest of the brain and the nervous system, that's sort of the same barrier that prevented me from being able to experience imagined visual sensations. And I feel like now I'm navigating that barrier more effectively, or it's no longer as strong. All of this is very conceptual, and like I've said probably too many times in this video, that it's gotten annoying. Not entirely sure about any of it. But I was requested to make... I wasn't actually requested to make this video, but I was requested to take down some of this information and put it together, so this is how I chose to do it. So I hope that the people who are particularly curious about this find it as useful as I have certainly found all of the information. I believe that is all that I have to say. Thank you for watching this grievously unedited and completely unrehearsed video. I hope that the knowledge does you good. Yeah, that's about all.